Olá! Se você está escutando essa voz muito bonita, você já sabe de quem é, provavelmente. Meu nome é Giovanna e hoje eu estou aqui, junto da minha colega Fernanda Mirelli, para apresentar a vocês o nosso episódio do podcast Bilinguismo para Todos, onde nós vamos entrevistar a professora doutora Anne Beatty-Martinez. Ela é cientista e professora da Universidade da Califórnia em San Diego. Mas antes de vocês escutarem esse podcast maravilhoso, esse bate-papo que a gente fez com ela sobre os estudos e os artigos publicados na área do bilinguismo, é muito importante que vocês entendam alguns termos que fazem parte da entrevista que vocês vão escutar. O primeiro termo que vocês precisam prestar atenção é o codeswiticing. O codeswiticing em português significa alternância de código e basicamente é quando você muda entre dois ou mais idiomas. Vamos supor, eu falo português e inglês, eu sou bilíngue e eu estou em um contexto onde tem pessoas de dois idiomas falando comigo, então eu vou alternar esses idiomas para eu conseguir, de forma fluida e natural, me adaptar ao contexto ou atender uma necessidade comunicativa que eu preciso naquele momento, naquela conversa com aquelas pessoas que falam os dois idiomas que eu também falo. E isso é muito comum entre os bilíngues e multilíngues, porque é legal de você alternar e se adaptar ao contexto para exercitar um pouquinho o cérebro, né? O segundo termo que talvez vocês escutem é o Codemixing, que é uma mistura de códigos. É um fenômeno linguístico de incorporar os elementos, por exemplo, as palavras ou frases ou algum termo específico de dois ou mais idiomas ou dialetos dentro de uma frase, dentro de uma conversa. Isso daí ocorre bastante. Diferente do codeswiticing, que você vai falar bastante entre os dois idiomas, é mais do que uma frase, vamos dizer assim. O codemixing, ele é pequeno, ou seja, é uma palavra, uma frase bem pequena. Normalmente a gente usa isso quando a gente quer dar um contexto maior do que aquilo que a gente está falando, a necessidade. Por exemplo, existe uma palavra que tem uma definição perfeita no outro idioma que eu sei falar e eu preciso usar ela para a pessoa entender. Por exemplo, fui ao cine last night, ontem à noite. Ou fiz uma tattoo. Bem comum no português a gente usar isso daí. Switch costs, que é outro termo que vocês podem escutar, significa custos de troca, que é basicamente um atraso no tempo de reação, ou seja, você dá aquele delay no cérebro, ou o aumento de erros que ocorre quando a gente alterna da nossa primeira língua, a L1, para a L2. Então, vamos supor que eu estou conversando com você em português, chega um colega meu que fala inglês, eu começo a falar com ele, para eu voltar a falar português com você, tem um custo. E aí o meu cérebro vai demorar um pouquinho para eu conseguir voltar para o português de imediato. Outra coisa que vocês vão escutar é o Bilingual Language Control, ou Cognitive Control, que é o controle cognitivo bilíngue. É uma habilidade, basicamente, que o cérebro tem de gerenciar os dois idiomas ativamente. Ou seja, eu estou aqui num contexto, vamos supor, estou na UFRN tendo aula, e eu sei que daqui a pouco eu vou começar a falar inglês. Então, o meu cérebro ele já começa a se adaptar àquele contexto para que eu possa selecionar o idioma correto e suprimir o outro idioma, por exemplo, falar português, eu suprimo o meu inglês e vice-versa, que vai fortalecendo essa questão das multitarefas, a flexibilidade mental para eu focar naquele idioma correto. Outra coisa que vocês vão escutar que é bem esquisitinho é o N400, que é um ERP Component, o ERP Component. O ERP significa potencial relacionado a evento e é uma forma de medir uma atividade elétrica do cérebro enquanto a pessoa está processando alguma linguagem, ou seja, você vai colocar aquelas touquinhas, bem cientista mesmo, para ver o que está acontecendo na sua mente enquanto você está processando o idioma. E o N400 é um sinal que o seu cérebro manda, que ele é medido pelo potencial relacionado ao evento, o ERP, e ele aparece quando a gente escuta algo que não faz sentido. Por exemplo, a cachorra da minha mãe. Você sabe que eu tô falando da cachorra, o animal que minha mãe tem, mas parece que eu tô falando que minha mãe é uma cachorra e não faz sentido. Então, isso daí é quando dá tipo um nó no seu cérebro, vamos dizer assim, e ele não tá entendendo, tipo assim, o que tá acontecendo. Fugiu do esperado que a gente estava tentando escutar e aí veio algo inesperado e aí manda esse sinal. A gente consegue captar esse sinal do N400. Outra coisa que vocês também vão escutar, pra gente finalizar, é o distributional patterns, que significa padrões de uso ou regularidades estatísticas. E são os padrões que aparecem no jeito de uma comunidade falar. Por exemplo, em comunidades bilíngues, por exemplo, no Porto Rico, onde eles vão mudar do inglês para o português, para o espanhol muito rápido, é comum que eles usem o artigo definidor no espanhol e o substantivo no inglês. Por exemplo, el dog ou la fork, o cachorro, o garfo. E aí ele vai, meio que o cérebro ele vai se adaptar a esse contexto para ele conseguir mudar e moldar a forma, a identidade linguística que uma comunidade certa vai ter, certo? Então, agora que você já escutou e sabe a definição de todos esses termos específicos que você vai escutar, aproveite o nosso podcast. Beijão!
Good morning, good evening, or good afternoon. I don't know what time you're watching this. Today we're here, me and Fernanda, as the hosts for the Bilinguismo para Todos podcast. And we have here the honor to have the rising star Professor Anne Beatty-Martinez to talk a little bit with us about the bilingualism, the bilingual brain, and a little bit about her studies in bilingualism in education specific, right? So, how are you, Annie, today?
I'm doing well. Thank you so much for the invitation. I look forward to an interesting discussion.
Perfect. So, in the beginning of the semester, we started to take a lecture in UFRN, the place we studied, the Federal University of Brazil. We have the introduction to bilingualism with one of your friends, teacher, Professor Janaína Wesheimer. And one thing that is really cool about this lecture that we took is the fact that we only studied women in the psycholinguistics area. And you were one of the women that we studied. And since we have been in contact with your work, we fell in love immediately, me and Fernanda, and we said we need to have her as one of our guests for the podcast. And in advance, I would like to say that we both are sorry if we misspeak something in or a term, but we're very nervous. But it's a true honor to have you with us tonight, this afternoon for you, right? So
Yeah, it's 2 p.m. in the West Coast, and the honor is mine. Thank you so much. Yes.
Okay, so my friend Fernanda is going to start asking questions about your work, and I'm going to be putting. Don't be nervous if you tell for us how can I say a term for the bilingualism like code switching or translanguaging, because we're going to be putting together in this video the definitions of those terms for everybody to understand what's bilingualism, what you're going to talk about, and your work. Okay?
Okay, so first, I would like to say that again, it is an honor to have you here today. So I would like to start asking one question about your 2017 study, which was the one that we saw in our classes with Professor Jana. So your study highlights that the bilingual comprehension becomes optimally attuned to the distribution patterns of the input, especially in communities where code switching is really common. So we want to know if you think that these adapted mechanisms develop over time, and what does this reveal about the bilingual brains, about the brain's ability to reorganize these linguistic expectations based on the social experience.
Yeah, so if I may, I'd like to put a little bit of background what led to this study of code switching using different psycholinguistic, but also psycholinguistic techniques that are sociolinguistically informed, if you will. So it was my first big study as a graduate student, and I had the pleasure, the amazing opportunity to be in a very interdisciplinary program where I was taking classes on language, language processing, but also linguistics from different perspectives, for example, usage-based variationist linguistics. And a very central core theme to all of these different courses was bilingualism, right? But being approached from very different disciplines that traditionally were very separate and did not talk to each other. And so with the case of code switching, it's really interesting because code switching has been studied from these very different perspectives, and they all have their histories and perspectives of what they seem to emphasize. And so many decades ago, sociolinguists, for example, were out in the world with their recorders in communities collecting bilingual speech, right? And so we can start off with the assumption that bilinguals were just randomly switching between languages. And it wasn't until you had this collection of naturalistic data and you started quantifying the different kinds of switching patterns, switching tendencies, what are more common switch points, are there preferences? Are these preferences constrained by the types of languages? Are they constrained depending on the type of community and things like that? So that was happening in the sociolinguistic tradition, and you see papers in the 70s and the 80s along that line. The psycholinguistic perspective on code switching developed much later. And interestingly, it came from the task switching literature. Okay, so for people with a more cognitive psychology background, a very common finding is that when you give participants two different tasks with different instructions and you have to switch between those sets of instructions, there's a cost. Sometimes you're slower or less accurate when switching between different tasks than staying in the same task with the same instructions. And so that concept of task switching was applied to language switching. And so the very early studies about code switching in the lab from a psycholinguistic perspective were, for example, these digit switching, language switching tasks, where you would have numbers in different colors and you would name in Portuguese in red or English in blue or something like that, right? And you found the typical finding was, again, very similar to the task switching literature, where there was a switch cost. Okay, a switch cost on switch trials compared to non-switch trials. And then there was also this added finding that the switching direction mattered. Okay, that it was costlier to switch from your non-dominant language or your L2 to your first language than vice versa. Okay, and then those studies were eventually developed into more sentences, more the stimuli were closer to that you find out in the wild, in more similar to natural bilingual speech. But the emphasis was still the same, right? Trying to find that switch cost and looking at switching directions. So going back to the study, and I know there's a circle, I'll go back. Going back to the study, at that point as a student, I was immersed into this bilingualism literature from both angles, the sociolinguistic perspective and the psycholinguistic perspective. And on the one hand, I saw one literature's quantifying all of these switching patterns and switching tendencies, showing that bilinguals who are highly proficient in the two languages commonly switch between their languages, that there are community norms. Some switch points are more favorable than others, particularly if there's syntactic equivalence between the two languages. All these very interesting distributional asymmetries depending on not just switching direction, but in the case of the particular study that you're referencing, the grammatical gender in Spanish mixing with English and these mixed noun phrases, and all of these very interesting findings about naturalistic data. At the same time, you have the literature with the switch costs from the psycholinguistic perspective. And so at that stage, there was very little work out there actually integrating or combining those two insights, right? And so what I did in that study, or I attempted to do, right, was create experimental materials that mirrored these well-documented code switching asymmetries in two groups of Spanish English bilinguals. Okay, so one group came from habitual code switching communities where presumably they were exposed to these switching patterns, and we also have production data showing that they would abide by these distributional preferences. And then the other group were these non-code switching bilinguals, where they were still very proficient in Spanish and English, but they just didn't have the experience of commonly alternating between the two languages, right? And so that's kind of like the backstory and motivation to look at these two populations and to look at different kinds of switches, right? So the question in that paper was whether these switch costs that have been observed in the literature, in the psycholinguistic literature, depend on not only the kind of bilingual, but the kind of switch. Okay? And then long story short, that's what the paper finds eventually. So the question that you're asking is, that was one measurement taken in these young adults in these bilingual samples from these two contexts. So I think it's an open question. To what extent are these patterns learnable? Can you adapt and become sensitive to these code switching preferences, right? And so I think that's a very interesting question, one that we don't know the answer to. But presumably, the system is very adaptive, right? And so if we took bilinguals with a non-code switching background and we had them in a context immersed with code switchers, right? If they have presumably a long experience exposed to these patterns, and even we have some data showing that they're incorporating them to some extent in their speech, then the hypothesis is that they too would show sensitivity. We don't know how long, so the immersion time, like how much exposure is necessary, nor do we know if the sensitivity is qualitatively similar or not, right? So they might show some sensitivity, but if measured with the event-related potential technique, they might show a qualitatively different ERP response. That we don't know. So it's a good question, and I hope someone eventually does this study because I think there are a bunch of questions out there about adaptation, right? And we don't know if it's just a couple months, a couple weeks, right? Or maybe it takes years of living in these communities. Another factor that we haven't talked about is motivation. The code switching carries often a social stigma. So some people, even though they're highly proficient in the two languages, really prefer to keep their languages separate and not really mix them, right? So it could be that these people are also exposed to code switching, but don't show sensitivity in the same way, right? So at this point where we don't know, I'm just speculating, but it would be really interesting to find out.
Okay, perfect. So another thing that we would like to ask you is about the code switching as a cognitive strategy. As I told you, we read a lot of papers from other women like Antonieta Magali, Judy Crow, Guadalupe, and many other studies on bilingualism and specific on code switching. And some models, they propose that bilinguals use code switching strategically to ease the utterance planning or reduce lexical retrieval difficulty. And based on your findings, that is actual code switchers show reduced switch costs. Do you see code switching more as a linguistic habit, a cognitive optimization strategy, or something that is socially driven that tends to shape cognition?
I think that's a great question. So when it comes to these cognitive adaptations, right? So it's a big question in the research on bilingualism is to what extent certain aspects of language experience act as these drivers of adaptation, especially in the realm of cognitive control. So we have some evidence suggesting that certain aspects of language experience, for example, being in a context where you have a variety of different kinds of interlocutors, where sometimes you have to speak the L1, sometimes you have to speak the L2. In other cases, you're free to use both interchangeably. That kind of varied heterogeneous experience might be more associated with a more proactive context monitoring adaptation effect. We don't see that tendency with habitual code switchers, right? So that leads to the question, does code switching lead to some, so why doesn't full-blown code switching experience lead to the same adaptive effect? And does it lead to something else? So my view on this is that if you are in a context where, and the context is really important in shaping this demand, right? The communicative demands on speakers. If you're in a context where you are surrounded by other bilingual interlocutors who are similarly bilingual, where you're free to use your 2 or more languages interchangeably, then there's no need to proactively monitor with whom do you have to use which language, right? You're free to use your languages cooperatively. And so perhaps that's why you're not seeing that proactive adaptive effect in this particular type of experience. However, does that mean that code switching doesn't lead to any adaptive effect? We don't know. One working hypothesis, and the research on this is still at very early stages, is that that bilinguals may code switch as a sort of opportunistic planning approach, right? And so this is in scenarios where, again, you have a bilingual habitual code switcher interacting with another bilingual code switcher, right? Where they're free to use their languages interchangeably. It's very interesting now, word choice, right? So when we are speaking, we're constantly making choices about which words are we using, which syntactic structures are we using, et cetera, et cetera. This applies to everyone, even if you only speak one language. If you are bilingual and you're in a context when you're interacting with another bilingual interlocutor and you're habitually switching, you have more choices now, right? So you not only have different words and alternatives within a language, but also across languages, right? And so now this is a very interesting opportunity that code switching in a way presents this lens to study potential trade-offs between accessibility and frequency of words. So frequency and efficiency, sorry, of different alternatives in word choice, right? So it could be that one word is very frequent, but it's not as precise in capturing your communicative intent, right? So you could have the option of going for a less frequent, more precise option in one language, but maybe the other language has a more frequent and still very precise alternative, right? So that may prompt people to switch between languages in conversation. So this is something obviously very hard to probe experimentally, but it could potentially be one of these cognitive drivers behind code switching. Because I always encourage people to think like, why are people switching in the first place, right? They could just stay in one language, even when interacting with another bilingual interlocutor. There's no reason, at least if we get rid of any like sociolinguistic or external variables, there's really no a priori reason to switch between languages. You could just stick to one. And so that necessitates the question about what are the cognitive or potential cognitive drivers behind code switching. And so that's one of them, that trade-off between accessibility and lexical precision. And in a way, this is opportunistic, right? So you can capitalize on these language choices to, for example, optimize your communicative intent. If you have some task at hand, maybe make it more efficiently. We've done this with some game scenarios, but the research on this is still at very early stages, but it's a very exciting avenue of research on code switching.
I take me as an example. Sometimes I know a perfect word that describes a situation in English. And when I'm with my friends that they are bilingual, I use the phrase in Portuguese, but the specific word in English for them to try to understand my idea when I'm trying to give my speech. Perfect.
Yeah.
Okay.
So the next question is, one thing about your study that we saw is that the ERP results showed us that the code switchers displayed a N400 sensitivity to gender congruence, unlikely the non-code switchers people. So during that mixed non-phrase processing. So what do you think are these neurodifference tell us about the bilingual brain's predictive and processing mechanisms, and how these finds may influence in how we measure the bilingual proficiency beyond the self-ratings?
Okay, good question. So, in the ERP study, we find qualitatively different ERPs depending on the group and depending on the comparison, right? So, for the habitual code switchers, we find an N400 component for that condition comparing a commonly attested code switch to a rarely attested code switch. And when we frame it this way, finding this component makes a lot of sense. You find it as an index of expectancy in language comprehension, right? So as you're processing, you're getting information about what to expect next. And particularly in that rare condition, you should not expect, if you're exposed to these code switching patterns, you shouldn't expect a code switch following this determiner la in Spanish, right? So that la fork generates that N400 effect, a larger N400 relative to the el fork congruent condition. There's also another, so one could do that on a purely semantic basis, right? As an expectancy violation. This also can be explained from a morphosyntactic perspective as a grammatical gender violation. Grammatical gender violations are kind of tricky in the ERP literature because they often elicit different ERP responses. Most commonly, we have an earlier negativity like left anterior negativity LAN or N400. So some studies show one or the other, followed by a later P600. So that's very common when you have grammatical gender violations between a determiner and a noun. And this is essentially what is happening with these distributional asymmetries in code switching. And so when you think about, even if we frame it from a morphosyntax perspective, it's still some sort of expectancy violation, right? So after a feminine determiner, you expect a feminine noun. And when you don't get it, even in English, the translation equivalent is not feminine. In the case of la fork, in Spanish, it's el tenedor, it's not la. You get that violation, right? So this would explain this type of component. And so what happens with the non-code switching bilinguals? The non-code switching bilinguals, it gets a little bit complex because there's something tricky going on, and I might have to do a full circle about grammatical gender processing, which I don't think it will take too much time for me to go there. But the only component you get is the P600 effect with nouns that are feminine. And that's something I'm going to put on the side a little bit. You do get that component essentially for a grammatical gender violation in monolinguals processing grammatical gender violations in Spanish. So you do get that sort of morphosyntactic effect in that sense. But what I do want to emphasize, which I think is more relevant to the code switching picture, is that the non-code switching bilinguals show this early frontal positivity when you compare a switch to a non-switch condition. And that I think is very important because first of all, this component occurs much earlier than the N400 window. So it's about 200 milliseconds, if I remember correctly. And it's basically showing sensitivity to this is no longer Spanish, right? This is a change in language, right? And the habitual code switchers don't show that effect, right? So we don't know if having the earlier effect interferes with later components, and maybe that's why you don't see the N400 in that group. So that's something that could be possible, right? But that component I think is very interesting because it speaks to bilinguals' attentional control states, whether they're much more narrowed to exploit one particular language, as non-code switchers typically are, right? They compartmentalize their language use, right? So when they're in one mode, they're exploiting L1, and the other one, they're exploiting the L2 very separately. And so what happens when you encounter a switch? You have to broaden that attentional state. And I think that's what that early frontal positivity is tapping into. The habitual code switchers are already broad, right? They use their languages very cooperatively, very interchangeably, and then that I think that's why they don't show that component, right? They expect different languages to come about, right? And so I think that's my 2 cents of the explaining the different kinds of ERP components in that study.
So, talk a little bit about this thing that you said of the preference for the determinate and the noun that they're going to say after. Now a question about this production, the comprehension links. One of the central claims in your work is that production practices in a community-shaped comprehension patterns. And in the corpus text, code switchers mirror naturalistic distribution asymmetries. For an example, the preference for L and the English noun right after. How do you see this relationship between speaker behavior and listener expectations informing future research on bilingual interaction contexts?
I think this is really important, right? And it really sets the stage that when we're doing psycholinguistic experiments and we're building those experimental stimuli, we want to make sure that they are representative or at least sensitive to the kinds of distributional patterns that you find in natural language use, right? And so having that, this is why the insights from the sociolinguistic literature were so important, so relevant, because they showed a very clear preference for one kind of switch, whereas the other kind of switch was rarely attested in naturalistic data. And so I think it's one of the very fortunate aspects of where the field is going is that we are starting to hear each other and listen to each other, right? And a lot of the students are being trained in interdisciplinary programs. And so they're coming up already exposed to these different voices that traditionally, it's not that they didn't like each other, it's that they were in different buildings, right? They were in different buildings, different traditions, right? And so it was very rare to have even like Zoom calls, right? Like that wasn't a thing back then, right? But now there's no excuse. So now it's stricter. Now we have to you maximize those insights. If we want to do psycholinguistic experiments looking at language comprehension, we have to be aware that listeners are sensitive to all of these production patterns, right? And so depending on the research question, we want to take that into account when building our experimental materials.
Perfect.
So, the last question about your paper is that your work, it kind of challenged that idea that code switching is like inherently costly or disruptive. So, considering that evidence that bilinguals kind of adapt to statistical regularities of their environment, what do you think, what do you believe are the major implications for theories of bilingual language control, especially on the models like the adaptive control hypothesis?
Yeah, that hypothesis, the adaptive control hypothesis, was central in the formation of my research program. And
Yeah.
it's no coincidence that I started grad school the year that that paper came out. So a very influential paper, and it's still influential to this day. So what do I think about codes? Code switching, the implications of this finding, right? That there are boundary conditions to switching costs. In regards to, I'm sorry, I missed the last part. So, in relation to the cognitive control literature, could you repeat that last part? Yeah.
Yeah, sure. It's like in, yes, because we want to know, especially in models like this adaptive control hypothesis, these implications of the language control of the bilinguals.
Yeah, so I think that kind of goes back to what I was saying about these attentional control states, right? So in the first couple of studies, the, we're just taking one measurement in time, so it's really hard to speak to how dynamic these systems are. But if we start putting pieces together from different studies, we start to get a fuller picture. So the idea is, at least with that, let's take the findings of this study that we just explained, the 2017. This early frontal positivity that you find in the non-code switchers, but you don't get in the habitual code switchers. So if this is an index of these attentional control states, right, where showing that early frontal positivity means that you're going from a narrow state to a broader attentional state, and the code switchers don't show that effect. Okay, so we could ask the question, what happens if we put code switchers in a context where code switching is inappropriate, right? So what happens? So this is right now, I'm a habitual code switcher, but I'm in a context where I'm just using English, right? So I have to be competitive. It would be inappropriate for me to just start switching into Spanish, right? And so we could actually look at, can these habitual code switchers become narrow, right? Develop this narrow attentional state, and then it would be a much more dynamic system, right? A more dynamic adaptive response. So there is some evidence that speaks to this. There is a study by a different lab by Edith Kahn. This is another ERP study. And they really had a ingenious audience design where they took habitual code switchers and they put them in a context where they were placed next to either a monolingual interlocutor or a bilingual interlocutor. And then they were exposed to different types of code switches. And one of the findings of the study was that when habitual code switchers are with a bilingual, they don't show this early frontal positivity effect, just like the code switchers in the 2017 study. If you pair habitual code switchers with a monolingual interlocutor, then they become sensitive to switches, right? And then they show this early frontal positivity effect. And what this suggests then is that these attentional states are dynamic and they depend on the communicative demands of the context, right? So this makes a lot of sense. It's very intuitive finding. If you're in a context where it's inappropriate it's sociopragmatically inappropriate to switch between languages, where the expectation is that you're just speaking one, not the other, then you should obviously constrain your attentional system to focus and exploit on that language, right? So if the context is free, you're surrounded by other bilingual interlocutors who are similarly bilingual, and sociopragmatically it's appropriate to switch, then go ahead, right? And then you can be broad in that sense. So we do have some indirect evidence suggesting that at least from the code switchers you can broaden and narrow it up, but we don't have what goes back to your first question for the non-code switchers, if they can be broad, right? So that's one of the gaps in the literature, but that's why we need amazing young researchers to fill those gaps.
Perfection.
Thank you.
We would like to ask you now a non-professional question, but it's more about your personal opinion. And we don't want to put you in hot water because you know that you are someone public, right? But it's a question about your culture, right? And a little bit about nowadays that we see the scenario that United States is facing around the world. So as a Puerto Rican researcher working at the intersection of language, identity, and bilingual experience, we would like to know, how do you interpret the global rise of artists like Bad Bunny, right? Especially that now he's set to perform at the Super Bowl halftime show, one of the most symbolic American stages, in a political moment which is shaped by the nationalist rhetoric and the anti-immigrant sentiment during and after the administration from the government of the United States. What does Bad Bunny's mainstream success reveal about shifting cultural and linguistics ideology in the US? And do you think that this kind of visibility, where Spanish and Spanglish and Puerto Rican cultural practices are embraced by global audience, can help broader society better understand the everyday bilingualism and cultural hybridity in studying Puerto Rican and Latin communities?
Yeah, so I'll start off saying that I'm from the Caribbean, so I love hot water. Yeah, so no problem there. So my thoughts on Bad Bunny. Okay, so musically, it's not my cup of tea, but I have to say I do admire how he's really put Spanish and Puerto Rican culture central stage. And it is very nice to see that as his celebrity status grows and increases, the more he brings it back home. So I think that's something that he should be very proud of, and that we all, I think most of us, support that he does this kind of thing. Because with other artists, the more mainstream they become, the more they shift to just singing in English, and they lose ties with their origins, right? So with Bad Bunny, it's kind of the opposite. And I think with his last album, even if you're not the biggest fan of Bad Bunny, you can find something here or there to listen to and appreciate all these cultural references. And linguistically, it's a jewel just looking at all those regionalisms and just that variety of Puerto Rican Spanish. So there's a lot to unpack there. I say props to him for participating in the Super Bowl. I'm so glad that he's doing it in Spanish and that he keeps to his roots. That's actually one of the positions where you don't have to switch. You can just stick to Spanish, and that's fine. For those of you who may not know, there are more Spanish speakers in the United States than in Spain.
Wow.
So that's a really important number to keep in mind. We're second only to Mexico, and even that number might change. So we shouldn't underestimate how many Spanish voices we have in the United States. And so more power to him. I'm so glad that he's gonna do it in Spanish, and I'll tune in to see it.
Yeah. One thing that I really like it to see is that he made the whole advertising of his performance at the Super Bowl, which is World Cup for the United States, right? Everybody stops
Yes.
to watch. And he says, if you didn't understand this, you have 6 months to learn Spanish and try to understand my performance. And I feel honored to have you as inspiration, both me and Fernanda, as Latinas, as women that we are in science. Like we are young researchers. We're just starting, and we see you and your work as a true honor and inspiration to be following your steps for the future, right? And
So, and as Giovanna said before, our professor Janaína, she always tries to bring like the research of women in bilingualism. And one thing that she does that we think is really awesome is that she always put the picture, because when we saw only the name, especially that we use the last name, we always tend to think that the researcher is a man, right? And so she does that for us to associate. And as Giovanna said, again, you are really inspiration for us and for all young women in science. So we want to know if you have like a message for the women that are starting or they're already in the science environment.
psycholinguistics, yeah,
Yes.
just like us.
Well, thank you so much for the very kind words. It's very generous of you. Um, so if I can say a message, and it's not necessarily gender specific, but what I like to tell the younger generations of language scientists or future language scientists is that where you start does not determine where you go. And I think that's a very important message for people to hear. When I started, I was a foreign language major in the humanities. I had no statistical training. I did not know any experimental techniques. I remember I didn't know what an eye tracker was or looking at event-related potentials. All these techniques were very new to me. And an easier route perhaps would have been to stick to what was familiar, I had done, what was closer to home, not leave my island to pursue graduate studies. But I did not take that road, right? I did decide to pursue graduate studies. Um, I my PhD is in Spanish, and yet currently I am in a cognitive science department. And so I think there oftentimes we fear that because we started in a certain discipline or we have a certain background or training, that we cannot compete with other people with other technical expertise, programming skills, and other backgrounds. And if there's anything that my life experience, professional experience has taught me, is that those things you can learn, right? But instead of focusing on what, and looking at that difference as a potential limitation, you have to flip the argument around and then really show this is what I am bringing that is different, right? So just by virtue of being in the humanities and being exposed to all of these insights from sociolinguistic studies and sociolinguistic field work, I was able to enrich the psycholinguistic literature in a way that had I come from a more typical cognitive or neuroscience background, I wouldn't have been exposed to that literature, right? And so I always tell my students, be bold, and where you start does not determine where you'll go, right? So you guys are young, you could still move around. In my experience, the department label doesn't mean that much, right? These days, the fields are so interdisciplinary that you can learn how to straddle those disciplinary fences, right? To talk to different people. And it's always such a pleasure because you get to hear different perspectives and bridge them potentially, right? Furthering the field. And so those are my 2 cents to any new generation of language scientists.
So, I would like to say thank you so much. Muchas gracias for accepting participating in our podcast. And as we say in Brazil, obrigada, because this is
Obrigada.
going to open a lot of people's minds, and to know that we have you as a Latina having the example in the psycholinguistics is very important for us to see, right? So thank you so much for accepting. Thank you so much for participating, sharing your studies, sharing your opinion. And we look forward to have in the future maybe a second podcast. We would like to ask you after some other words.
I would be happy to. Thank you so much.
That's
Thank
it.
you, Annie. It was our honor to have you here. We're really happy.
So I'm going to stop recording